Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Climate change is an issue that many of us hear about almost every day, whether on the news, on social media, or in school. However, despite how often it is discussed, it can still feel distant or overwhelming. Today's panel discussion titled The 2030 Countdown, Climate Action Now, is meant to bring this issue closer to home and make it more concrete, especially in the Malaysian context. The year 2030 is often described as a critical deadline. Scientists warn that if we do not significantly reduce greenhouse gas emission by then, the impacts of climate change could become far more severe and difficult to reverse. This means that climate action is not something we can delay or postpone. It is something that must happen now. In Malaysia, we are already seeing the effects of climate change. Floods are becoming more frequent and intense. Heat waves are more common, and weather patterns are increasingly unpredictable. These changes affect agriculture, infrastructure, public health, and the cost of living. So today's discussion is not just academic, it is our present reality and our future. Let me introduce our panelists. Hakim will focus on the causes and factors behind climate change. Jenny will discuss the impacts and consequences, especially in Malaysia. Zixuan will focus on solution strategies and how they can be implemented in real life. Austin will focus on accountability, policy, and what governments and institutions must do moving forward. Let us begin with the causes of climate change. Hakim, climate change is often described as a human-made problem. Do you agree with this? And what do you see as the main causes?
Yes, I strongly agree that climate change is largely human-made. The most significant driver is the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. These fuels are used for electricity generation, transportation, and industrial activities. When they are burned, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere, trapping heat and rising global temperatures. In Malaysia, this issue is particularly relevant because our energy system still depends heavily on coal and natural gas. Even though renewable energy is slowly increasing, fossil fuels remain dominant. Once power plants are built, they operate for decades, which means emissions are locked in for a long time. Another major factor is deforestation. Forests absorb carbon dioxide, but large areas of forest have been cleared for agriculture, urban development, and infrastructure. This not only remove carbon sinks, but also release stored carbon back into the atmosphere. Transportation is another key factor. Our cities are designed around private vehicles. Public transport exists, but it's not always efficient or accessible, which push people towards cars and motorcycles.
Zixuan, do you agree with Hakim's explanation?
Yep, I agree with Hakim's explanation, especially regarding fossil fuels and deforestation. However, I would like to add that these activities are symptom of deeper structural issues. For example, we often talk about emissions from transport, but we rarely talk about why people rely so much on private vehicles. That is a city planning issue, not just an individual choice. Similarly, deforestation doesn't happen because people do not care about forests. It happens because economic systems reward short-term profits over long-term sustainability. So I think climate change is not just about energy or land use, but about how our society defines development and success.
Yeah, I agree with Zixuan on the point. Climate change is not simply a technical failure, it's a governance failure. We already know what causes emissions, yet we continue to make the same decisions because they are politically convenient or economically profitable in the short term. However, I want to disagree slightly with how we sometimes frame responsibility. We often say everyone is responsible, which is true to some extent, but not everyone has equal power. Large corporations, financial institutions, and governments make decisions that shape entire systems. That is where the biggest responsibility lies.
I agree with that, but I also think individual behavior still matters. While individual cannot solve climate change alone, collective behavior can influence policy and market demand.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Hakim. But only if individual action is connected to systematic change. Telling individuals to recycle while approving new coal plants sends a mixed message.
That is an interesting tension. Jenny, do you want to add anything from the impacts perspective?
Yes, I agree with all of you that fossil fuels and land use are central issues. From an impact perspective, what worries me is the long time lag. Emission release today will affect climate change patterns for decades. That means delays now creates long-term consequences that are difficult to make.
A common argument we often hear is that strong climate action may slow economic growth or harm development, especially for developing countries. Zixuan, do you agree with this argument?
I don't fully agree with that argument. I understand why it exists because climate policies can raise costs in the short term. So, for example, switching to renewable energy or improving infrastructure requires large upfront investment. However, this argument usually ignores the cost of not taking action. Floods, droughts, and heat waves damage roads, homes, factories, and farms, which lead to huge repair costs and economic disruption. If we look at the bigger picture, climate action is actually a form of economic protection. Investing in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and climate resilient infrastructure can create new jobs and reduce long-term risks. So I don't see climate action as anti-development. I see it as a different model of development.
I agree with this one's point, especially about long-term costs. Economic growth that ignores environmental limits is not sustainable. If an economy grows quickly but keeps getting hit by floods, supply chain food disruptions, and health crises, that growth becomes fragile. However, I think we also need to be honest about transition challenge. Some sectors and workers will be affected, and if governments do not plan carefully, people may feel that climate policies threaten their livelihoods. That is why transition planning is very, very important.
Zixuan Hakim, I agree with both of you, but I want to push the decision further. Even when climate action clearly makes economic sense, it often still does not happen. That is because economic decisions are not neutral. They are shaped by power, lobbying, and vested interests. For example, fossil fuel subsidies still exist in many countries. These subsidies make polluting activities cheaper than they should be and discourage investment in clean energy. As long as these distortions remain, markets will continue to favor high carbon choices, even when they are harmful in long run.
Yep, Austin, I agree with that. And I think this is where public pressure becomes important. When people understand that subsidies are supporting pollution instead of helping society, they are more likely to demand change. Education and transparency really matter here.
So, would you say climate change is more of a political issue than an economic one?
Yes, I would say that the economic case for climate action is increasingly clear. The main barrier is political will and institutional inertia. Leaders may fear backlash, losing votes, or upsetting powerful industries.
I agree with you, Austin, but I would add that politics is influenced by public attitudes. If people see climate action as a threat and rather than an opportunity, politician will hesitate. So communication and fairness are just as important as technical solutions.
Let's move to the impacts. Jenny, could you explain how climate change is already affecting Malaysia?
Climate change is already very visible in Malaysia. Flooding has become more frequent and more severe, affecting both urban and rural areas. These floods damage homes, schools, roads, and farmlands. In many cases, families are displaced, students miss school, and local businesses suffer major loss. Rising temperatures are another concern. Heat waves increase health risks, especially for outdoor workers, the elderly, and the people with existing and known to be high risk factor on health conditions. Heat stress reduces productivity and also increase electricity demand as people rely more on air conditioning, which can further increase emission of HFC, contributing to climate change. Food security is also under threat. Changes in rainfall patterns affect rice production and other crops. When yields drop, food prices rise, and low-income households feel the impact too. Or in simple, inflation occurs among the daily needs, especially on the consumers.
I agree with that, Jenny, and I want to emphasize that these impacts are not evenly distributed. Low-income communities, rural populations, and informal workers usually suffer the most because they have fewer resources to adapt or recover. This is why climate change is also a social justice issue, not just an environmental one. For example, a flood might be inconvenient for a wealthy family, but devastating for a low-income household that cannot afford repairs or relocation.
Absolutely, Zishan. And I think insurance is a good example of this inequality. As climate risk increase, insurance premiums rise or coverage is withdrawn altogether. Wealthier people may still cope, but poorer households are left exposed. This shows why adaptation cannot be left entirely to market forces. Government intervention is necessary to protect vulnerable groups. How do you guys think?
I agree with all of you, but I think we also need to talk about preparedness. Too often, our response is reactive. We wait for a flood or heat wave to happen, and only then do we respond. Better planning, early warning system, and climate resilience infrastructure can reduce damage and save lives.
Do you think Malaysia is doing enough in terms of adaptation?
I don't think so. There are initiatives and policies, but many of the short terms are reactive or just reactive, just very short term. We need more proactive planning, especially for high risk and vulnerable communities. Adaptation should be seen as a long term investment and not just for emergency response.
Let's talk about solution. Zixuan, what does effective climate action looks like in practice?
Effective climate action must combine mitigation, adaptation, and public participation. Reducing emission is essential, but we must also prepare for impacts that are already unavoidable. So in practice, this means clear and consistent government policies, support for renewable energy, and investment in resilient infrastructure. Local governments should be empowered because climate impacts are often local. So besides that, I think education is also crucial because people are more likely to support climate policies when they understand how these policies benefit their lives.
Yeah, Zishan, I agree with you. But I want to emphasize enforcement. Voluntary commitments and targets are not enough. Thus, we need laws, regulations, and accountability mechanisms. If without enforcement, climate policies remain promises on paper rather than real action.
As we approach the final portion of today's panel, let's take a step back and consider our hopes for the future. We have discussed the challenges of climate change, the urgency of the 2030 deadline, and the potential solutions. But what are your expectations for what needs to happen in the coming year? Austin, let's start with you.
I believe our expectations should be rooted in accountability. Governments must go beyond just making announcements. They need to show tangible results. We need to demand timelines, clear data, and most importantly, enforcement. It's no longer enough for policies to look good on paper. If we are talking about meaningful climate action, we must have measurable milestones and hold both public and private sectors accountable for their progress. This is not just about political promises, it's about real world impact.
Absolutely, Austin. I want to add that my expectation lies heavily in stronger collaboration and education. So we often hear about climate change in silos, governmental bodies, environmental NGOs, scientists, and communities working in isolation. But the climate crisis is interconnected, and the solution must be too. I'm hoping to see more initiatives that encourage cross-sector collaboration, where everyone feels included in the conversation. And that includes youth, the indigenous communities, and local organizations. Furthermore, education plays a huge role, which I've mentioned a lot of time. The more people are educated about the science, the impacts, and the urgency, the more likely are for them to act and demand change themselves. Empowering communities with knowledge can drive collective action.
Yes, I'm totally agree with you, Sishan. And from my point of view, I expect more attention to be given on the adaptation efforts, particularly on vulnerable communities. Now, while mitigation strategies to reduce emission are vital, we must also consider how we adapt to the climate impacts we can no longer avoid. Vulnerable groups, whether it's low-income populations, small island nations, or rural communities, are often hit the hardest. I want to see more policies focused on improvising resilience in these areas. Whenever it's climate proving infrastructures, increasing access to clean water, or developing early warning systems, adaptation should be just as much a priority as mitigation. These communities deserve support not just after disaster strikes, but as a part of long-term sustainable efforts.
I couldn't agree more, Jenny. However, I want to focus on the role of science in this conversation. My expectation is for science to increasingly guide policy making. We have seen it in some places already. Government leaning on scientific advice to draft climate legislation and push forward sustainable development goals. But in many cases, policy decisions are still made without the full backing of science, often influenced by political ideologies or economic interests. Science must lead the way. The evidence is clear, and we have the knowledge. We need the political will to apply it. Policy should be based on the best available scientific data, with experts playing a larger role in the decision-making process.
Thank you for those insightful reflections. It seems like there is a common theme around accountability, collaboration, and ensuring that science and vulnerable communities aren't left behind. In conclusion, we can know that the climate action must be taken right now to prevent our Earth to be suffered in the greenhouse effect and to protect our next generation have a better life and brighter future. So that's all for our panel discussion today. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.